Thank you very much for these kind words. I'm not sure that I want to thank you for inviting me here. It depends on the results of this presentation, among other things. I'm here somewhat under false pretenses because I'm not really an expert in any of the things that are being discussed here. And this explains the subtitle, A View from the Outside. And the plan which you have in front of you, hopefully, in the handout. A somewhat apologetic introduction. I do not claim, as I said, any expertise in any of these fields that pertain to proto-language, in whatever sense the word proto-language is used, at this conference or indeed in any other context. But my scanty and selective knowledge of this subject, based on having read some of the materials published after the previous two conferences, as well as materials made public in the internet, allow me to share with you some thoughts formulated from the vantage point of a kind of external observer, that's the external view, whose only commitment is the belief that meaning is strictly connected with conceptualization, and that conceptualization can be conducted along different dimensions, and it can produce different construals of one and the same phenomenon. This is one of the main tenets of what is sometimes not very fortuitously called cognitive linguistics. I'm not going into details why I don't think this is a particularly good term to use in the context of what so-called cognitive linguists are doing. Having thus described my vantage point and this particular linguistic orientation, let me immediately say that, as I said in the handout, the most striking thing about some crucial terms being used during this conference is failure to observe the terminological principle, which says that one term ought to have one sense in a given text. That's the weakest possible version of this principle, and there are stronger versions that would say that one word should have one sense in other texts and discourses devoted to the same subject, and an even stronger version that one term ought to have one and the same sense in all possible texts written by other authors within the same field. Now, admittedly, the weakest version is carefully observed by particular authors, and I will not go into analyzing this, whereas the stronger versions are quite often elevated or not observed. Particularly the strongest one, by all kinds of authors dealing with the same topic. This can't be done simply for various reasons which I don't have to go into, particularly when you have to refer to other authors in your papers, make references, etc., then you have to involve yourself in some kind of meta-linguistic interludes explaining what is meant here and there when a particular word appears. A particular word is supposed to be a term. Now, language, proto-language, and other terms expressing various related concepts used in academic discourse, including with proto-language conferences, are no exception. They too result from conceptualizations along alternative construals of whatever undergoes conceptualization. The ultimate result of all this is what might be called, only with some exaggeration, terminological chaos, which consists in using one and the same term in different senses, and sometimes one sense being referred to by, or denoted rather, strictly speaking, by different terms. A well-known case of polysemy and synonymy, which is all right in everyday discourse, but ought to be reduced in an academic discourse. Now, to be more specific, I'm going to refer to two kinds of supporting. This is longer quotations supporting some of the claims that I'm going to make are contained in your handouts, and shorter references will be displayed on the screen. The first thing that needs to be noticed, and rather reminded of, because all of you undoubtedly are perfectly aware that there is a difference, that the English word language is ambiguous grammatically between being countable, a countable noun, and uncountable noun, or mass noun. So language without an article is a mass noun, article a, that is indefinite article, and it doesn't take any plural forms. Whereas the other sense is a countable noun and behaves like any other countable noun, takes the indefinite article a and other determiners, and also assumes plural forms. Now let us take a look at a handful of examples of how the sense of the uncountable noun, language, is described first in general dictionaries and encyclopedias, which presumably reflect the word, how the word is commonly understood, and next in selected text by language experts, that is linguists. A handful, or rather very, very selective handful of definitions in quotes. The method of human communication, the style of a piece of writing or speech, the phraseology and vocabulary, etc. Incidentally, this is an extract from Oxford English Dictionary. So a very, very authoritative source. Then number 4, usually as bad, foul, strong language, a non-verbal method of expression, and programming language. All these are the senses of the uncountable noun language. There are also senses of the countable noun language, but I shall forego them for the moment, please. Now, what is interesting about this is that all these are interrelated through a rather intricate network of relations, senses, related through metonymies and metaphors. So I'm using basically the kind of approach applied by Ronald Lanaker when he describes such items as the ring or key, etc. as the senses representing networks of senses, which can be more or less presented like this. has a fragment of what others call radial structure, with the central, some would like to call it most prototypical sense 1, the method of human communication, and the other senses radiating from this by virtue of metonymies and metaphors. So, the style, a piece of writing, is a metonymy, obviously, referring to an aspect of what you can do with language. Phraseology and vocabulary is another metonymy. You use the word language to talk about some aspects of language. That is the kind of synecdoche called totum pro parte, the whole for a part. Bad, foul, strong language, likewise, is a metonymy. A non-verbal method of expression or communication is a metaphor, which consists in suppressing some important properties of language in the central sense, namely the property of verbal communication. And programming language suppresses yet another feature, also a metaphor, human. But all these other senses then are extensions from the original sense. That's what the dictionary says, only in a somewhat reformulated form. Linguists have never been too eager to formulate such simple, short definitions of language. However, most 20th century authors, classical authors, such as Sapir, Bloch, Trager, Hall, Watmow, and an endless list of others, would also try to produce very general descriptions, or in some cases simply avoid any possibility to be more specific. Sapir, for example, a classical definition of language, purely human and non-instinctive methods of communicating. Language, the institution whereby humans communicate. Hall, in his essay on language, very well-known source. Too many language is the most important form of human communication, etc. But as I said, some authors simply say this. I will begin by assuming that everyone knows in a general sort of way at least what language is and how it is used. That's John Lyons in his famous book Semantics. No, sorry, language, meaning, and context. Even worse, because in semantics there's not even that. Nothing at all. Now, this is the next slide, but before I explain the meaning of this, let me say that all these linguists are agreed that this is a typically human affair, and that every other possible use of the word language requires metaphorization or metonymization or both sometimes. Moreover, these definitions and many others testify to the existence of this fundamental conceptual difference between communication, language, and a language. They're completely different concepts. Obliterating these differences has an adverse influence on the understanding of other crucial terms, such as proto-language, by the same token. Proto-language, same level as language. A proto-language, a language, etc. Now, this sort of regiment, I might also refer you to the rather famous or infamous quotation from Chomsky once again. I know that Chomsky is not very enthusiastically referred to in various places, and I'm sure that at this very conference he would also have quite a number of adversaries. But let me perhaps make a point at this point by referring you to the handout, again, the first quotation in the handout, which comes from Chomsky. I will spare you the unpleasant experience of reading it aloud. Let us just contemplate it in silence and let everyone do with it what one wishes to do with it. However, from the purely, well, taking a more neutral position, let me say that this sort of regimentation of the term language, which I've just hopefully accomplished, makes it possible to situate it in the system of other meta terms, and sometimes abused in the discourse about proto-language. There are two subsystems of meta-terms which are particularly relevant at this point. In both, the respective terms are related by virtue of entailment. The first, sorry, something's gotten wrong here. Yes. The first system, language, a language, geographical, social varieties, dialects, and such like, idiolects. This I call individuality axis because the gradation is from the most general human property through successively more specific properties of nations, people, tribes, whatever, other speech communities, until you reach the level of individuals, idiolects, individual human beings. The entailment involves the fact that idiolects evolve as dialects a language, and the language entails language, but not the other way around. So language and whatever else are not equivalent. There is this entailment relation there. And the second system, proto-language, reconstructed proto-languages in plural, actually attested languages and their varieties. That's what I call time axis, because that is based on the availability of data, strictly linguistic data, which undergo processing of various sorts, modeling, generalizations, etc., etc. And they provide grounds for verifying particular models, making them more subtle, producing better and better approximations of what is being generalized to the original object. Contemporary linguists investigate the following kinds of data. Primary linguistic data. In the first place, texts in whatever medium, spoken, written, others. And secondly, contexts, participant settings, background knowledge. Now, in principle, all these data are available at a given moment for contemporary languages, and they can be accessed according to particular demands, depending on what kind of model a particular linguist wants to use. Some linguists in the extremely structural orientation would completely disregard Roman 2. Others, they would confine themselves only to texts of various sorts. Others would want to reach for more data, and the amount of data that they want to reach for depends on their particular needs, demands, and whatever. But in principle, they're always available. That the amount of data, all this, really, to a large extent, is responsible for particular linguistic schools and orientations and whatever happened in the course of the 20th century and various branches of structuralism and other models of description. Whereas applying the second approach, the time-based approach, dramatically, and going back in time, dramatically decreases, the amount of data which are available. Sorry, I'm going too far back. So given that for contemporary languages we have all these data, the going back in time gradually deprives us of the access to various kinds of data. First, the spoken data disappear, as it were, or vanish. Then the more distance we cover traveling back in time, the written data vanish and leave alone all these others. And of course, the contexts vanish too. So at the end of the day, looking from this point of view, we have no data whatsoever available for direct scrutiny. We are left with the method of historical comparison, comparative methods, and reconstruction, which, if solidly performed, leads to postulating something about proto-languages, in plural, proto-languages, on the basis of the comparative and reconstructive methods based directly on available data. And in that sense, any proto-language is a reconstructed synthesis of what is currently known about the state of, in the origins, historical origins of particular groups of languages. This is very neatly summarized in your handout 2, position 2, a quotation from Binon. So we are all familiar with the fact that in that sense there are quite a number of proto-languages that have been reconstructed, several score in fact of them. The more familiar ones, of course, are Proto-Indo-European, Proto-Germanic, Proto-Uralic, etc., Balto-Slavic, what have you. All these are proto-languages in the second sense of the word proto-language. Countable. Regrettably, this distinction between proto-language uncountable and proto-languages countable has not been consistently observed, at least with respect to terminology. The very title of this conference does not seem to leave a shadow of a doubt that the noun proto-language is used in its uncountable sense. There's no article there at all. But the titles of lectures being delivered here seem to contradict this. I'm not going to bother you and torment you with more data about this. You have a lot of quotations now in your handouts under point 4 to testify to this inconsistency. But my recent observation, while I was sitting here in this very seat, I was involved in a little calculation, counting the titles of presentations for this conference. And I've counted, give or take, 1, because there are problems translating this into Polish. And sometimes when the title is in Polish and the word język is used, there may be a little doubt whether it's used in the countable or uncountable sense. But I was trying to figure this out. Anyway, the results are surprising. In 13 cases, we have language used in the uncountable sense, and give or take 1, 9 cases language used in the countable sense. That also includes the use of proto-language, because basically there's no difference here. I mean, ontologically it's the same contrast. So there we are. We have an almost perfect balance here between proto-language and a-proto-language as used during this conference. Now, having said this, and if you've managed to live through the reading of the quotations, I have maneuvered myself into making the situation very clear, and to say that from my point of view, the title Ways to Proto-Language would be better off if we changed proto-language into pre-language. Ways to pre-language. If what I've said so far holds water, of course. I disagree with this, but I'm happy to tell you that what Professor Dunbar said today seems to corroborate this, particularly when it comes to what I call the dating imbroglio, which is an inevitable result of all these confusions. And I'm happy to realize that as much as I was able to understand of his really expert presentation of this subject, which I have very vague idea about, I wholeheartedly agree with his conclusion that language is a typically human institution, and as such, it couldn't have emerged or come into being earlier than, say, about 150,000 years ago, and not millions years ago. Whatever happened before that date does not concern language, it concerns some pre-language. Now, how much time do I have? All the time, because I need it. I badly need it. What? 4 minutes? Okay, sorry. Prevented me from a heart attack and everything, at least temporarily. Slide 13 shows you a little what I would call idealized cognitive model of language, to use Lakoff's terminology, consisting of all these features. To a large extent, they are repetition of Hockett's list of properties that characterize language. Every time I say human language, you may say, oh, you're using a pleonasm. And all these features, I'm sure, are very familiar. I'm not going to elaborate or explain them further, perhaps with one exception. That the only comment that I want to make about all this is that they are interrelated. That, for example, recursiveness and productivity are very intimately connected.
And the duality also has to do with all this. Moreover, this would open up an endless discussion that when you talk about recursiveness, you sometimes understand it in a very trivial or superficial way, as something that happens in complex sentences, the kind of repetition of multiple embedding with, in principle, no limit to it. But recursiveness is something much more sophisticated than that, and it has to do with conceptual processing and with mental faculties, and can be manifested only at the semantic and pragmatic level. So even if in strictly syntactic terms such languages as Piraha may have no recursiveness, but in that sense, but they certainly have recursiveness in the fact that it's based on duality, etc. This is a separate topic, though. I don't want to go into this. Particular systems such as bee dancing or herring gulls, care of offspring or gibbon calls or whatever else, suppress some of these features. They have some elements of this. These features fully appear only in human language, in language. One other thing that perhaps Hockett doesn't mention is reflexivity. Language is used to talk about language. That's one of the important things, that language can become meta-language. Whereas such a system of communication as bee dancing cannot be used to talk about bee dancing. So you can't use bee dancing to talk about bee dancing, etc. So that is also a property which is quite often overlooked in all types of discussions. By contrast, I want to show you a possible ICM, idealized cognitive model of a language. A language, prototypically, would be characterized by such properties. Again, you can contemplate this for a short while. If you have any comments or something that you'd like to add to it, let me know. This is just a proposal that what ICM of a language could look like. So now it's time to look at the consequences of these confusions. The dating imbroglio. In view of what I heard today from Professor Dunbar, I could very well skip this and say that I wholly agree with him, that we meet in the middle of a tunnel. He started digging from one end, I started digging from the other end, and we met, fortunately, somewhere. That's the essence of the language imbroglio before, I might say, before Dunbar. And here we have this other extreme. And of course, the span of time is absolutely formidable. And it can't be explained otherwise, and this is where I'll stop this bit, really, because everything that needed to be said about it was said by myself, now going back chronologically before me in the morning by Professor Dunbar. Now, all this is connected with a number of more subtle problems, more specific problems, such as the nature of the leap that was involved in there. this is where people now, I think that whatever you think about Chomsky, one of his main tenets was about that language came into existence saltationally, that is, not by means of a gradual evolution. This is something that prima facie may make you doubt and think. And if that is so, then it probably jeopardizes a lot of what is said now and will be said during these conferences. My view is that these two views are compatible and that they are not contradictory. On the one hand, you may have evolution, gradual. On the other hand, you may have leaps. All right. And again, Professor Dunbar's presentation convincingly shows this. I may add my own argument, digging from the other end of the tunnel, a kind of metaphor that referring to the famous container schema, which has two orientations, in and out. A container is a very simple pre-conceptual schema with enclosed area, 2 or 3 dimensional, and if it's an open container, there's a virtual boundary. The boundary separates the area in the container from the area out of the container. Now, evolution of language, or pre-language, whatever it was, may mean that the approach to the container was gradual. But the moment at which the trajectory finds itself in the container is sudden. All it takes is a fraction of a second to cross the boundary, virtual boundary. Now you're out, now you're in. Now you're out, now you're in. A fraction of a second. The approach is gradual, but being in it happens all of a sudden. So this, I hope, is a useful metaphor of what might happen with language. And in that case, Chomsky's saltational approach can be accepted. But as I said, I don't claim expertise in this, and I don't want to press this issue any further. Just if that container metaphor is helpful, take it. If not, forget about it. Now, the final section, questionable extrapolations. That's the final slide. You'll be surprised and happy to know. You might have noticed also that in my presentation, I tried to avoid these visual methods of presentation. I was trying to establish face-to-face, eye-to-eye, to the extent to which my eyes allow me to do so, contact with you. And again, whatever it proves about the situation of contemporary languages and whether or not they keep evolving or involving maybe to non-existence is another matter. If we could continue this sort of presentation in which the speaker, forgive me, spends 3/4 of his presentation looking at the screen and not looking at the audience, this may be an embryonic stage of language beginning to involve, to non-existence maybe. Again, I leave this to you to consider. I'm trying desperately to keep language alive, and I want to communicate with you through language rather than through pictures or anything else. I hope people who are fascinated by these media will not feel offended. I can only excuse myself by being in an advanced age and not really used to this very much, and preferring to stick to the old ways. The question of extrapolations. Regardless of whether one talks about pre-language, proto-language, proto-languages, and whatever, any change begins at the idiolect level. So here we have to go back for a very, we've got this really, at the idiolect level. That's where the primary data come from anyway. And then all kinds of generalizations which are made about idiolects concern dialects or lead to proposals concerning the structure of dialects. Every change begins at home, charity begins at home, and it gradually spreads from family to a tribe or whatever. Larger speech community covers larger and larger geographical areas, territories, depending on all kinds of factors, political, historical, cultural, whatever. The local change spreads like a wave. There's the famous wave theory of linguistic change. And if it reaches the territory corresponding with a nation or people, whatever, acquires the status of language change, linguistic change, rather than a local change affecting one dialect only. This is indeed a matter of extra-linguistic influences, rather, that rarely show that internal factors promote such changes. There are usually all kinds of political and historical, geographical reasons. Anyway, the next generalization concerns languages then. And then we can say that if you now try to make such generalizations applying the other axis, the temporal axis, with the vanishing data, you have to perform a methodological triple jump, because normally you have direct evidence for dialects. But if you want to go all the way to pre-language, then you have to skip over languages, language, and then reach some stage where, or it maybe is a quadruple jump, I don't know what, which inevitably leads to all kinds of problems. What is important here? That idiolects correspond to ontogenetic scale, ontogenetic dimension, whereas the other end concerns phylogenetic dimension. Therefore, making extrapolations on the basis of ontogenetic evidence involves this triple jump. In the absence of data to support one's generalizations in quotes about language, one has to skip all these stages and simply hypothesize rather than prove something. Petitio principii, this is called. What is to be proved is taken for a fact. That is, in this case, it is presumed that there was such a thing as language in the pre-language times, instead of demonstrating this to be true. The presumption rests on the evidence that you get from the ontological level, ontogenetic level. And it's very, very indirect as a result of this triple jump. And of course, many psycholinguists and many linguists in general are very much opposed to this sort of methodology. What's to be proved is taken for granted as an initial assumption that there was such a thing as language somewhere in the past. One of the main opponents of this view is a very well-known psycholinguist, Slobin, who presented very firm and solid evidence against such extrapolations. And again, in the handout, you find quite a lot of quotations in which reference is made to such things as ontogenetic, phylogenetic, isomorphism, which has never been proved, and mutatis mutandis. This concerns also extrapolations from such communication systems as the animal communication, as infant communication, at whatever stage. It's always the same thing, from ontology to from ontogenesis to phylogenesis, and from animal to human, etc. The same triple jump in all these cases. Now, for dessert, you have a number of quotations that are supposed to show you what such terminological, apparently only terminological problems might lead to. The kind of discussion, originally meant as a discussion, degenerates into a quarrel or a brawl full of invectives, offensive words, and it doesn't matter if this is all there in the internet. The internet is nowadays a forum, and the scandal which you have in front of you there originated as a bona fide discussion, really, in very civilized terms. And by, it degenerated into what you have there. I don't want to read this. My time is probably up anyway, and I'd rather have a little time for discussion or questions, so you can entertain yourselves with reading these rather, to put it mildly, impolite exchanges. And I might only wish that the discussions which take place or will take place during these meetings will never assume this sort of style. Thank you very much.